called at 8 for the purpose of ascertaining the whereabouts of the sheriff for making service.
The system of segregation was a bitter pill.
We were informed that Reverend King had been taken down to Reidsville at 4:05 this morning.
The year is 1917, and the war to end all wars is raging across Europe. And after 3 years of neutrality, the United States has entered the fray. In France, American foot soldiers, including thousands of African Americans, are fighting to defend liberty and democracy. But at home, the defense of liberty and democracy for African Americans will require a different kind of fight and a different kind of foot soldier. This fight will require foot soldiers for equal justice. Even as Americans were fighting for freedom in France, the civil rights of African Americans, so dearly purchased on the fields of Antietam and Gettysburg, were continuing to vanish. The 14th and 15th Amendments that had given them citizenship and the right to vote had been replaced with violence, intimidation, and second-class citizenship.
Life in these United States was commanded by a fellow named Jim Crow, who insisted that everything be separate and theoretically, but jokingly equal.
You didn't ride in white taxis nor vice versa. You didn't go to white schools. You didn't drink from white fountains. You didn't ride in the white part of the train. You didn't sit in the white part of the cinema. You weren't buried in the white part of the cemetery. And this went on and on and on.
Many blacks who resisted the indignities of Jim Crow paid with their lives. Between 1890 and 1917, hundreds were hanged, shot, or even burned alive. Many others just disappeared. The tragic fate of Daniel Barber and his children is an example. On January 15, 1915, Barber, his son Jesse, and his daughters Ella and Elva were lynched for resisting arrest in Monticello, Georgia. The ghastly ritual was carried out in the center of Monticello's black section, and Barber was forced to witness the hanging of his children before he met the same fate. Judge Herbert Phipps recalls a typical example from his early childhood in southwest Georgia.
I would hear my uncles and parents talk about the sheriff who was Warren Gator Johnson, and before him there was a sheriff by the name of Screws, and there was a case involving Screws that around the time that I was born, where he and some of his deputies went out to a black man's house in the middle of the night and tricked him into going with them under the pretense that they had a car broken down that they needed repairing, and he was a mechanic. And they lynched him at the courthouse, and I believe drug his body around the square.
For blacks in the Jim Crow South, there was virtually no legal recourse. Legislatures and city councils were all white, and so were the police, prosecutors, judges, juries, and prison officials. But by the time America entered the Great War, blacks were beginning to take the offensive. And in that same year, one of America's most brilliant, selfless, and courageous unsung heroes, a true foot soldier for equal justice, was born. His name was Donald Lee Hollowell. The youngest of Harrison and Osenia Hollowell's 3 children, Donald Hollowell was born on December 19, 1917, in Wichita, Kansas. In Harrison and Osenia's family, as in so many African American families, faith, hard work, and education were central values, especially education.
My mother had gone to Lincoln out in Jefferson City, where Lincoln was Lincoln Institute, and then to Western University in Kansas City, and my father had gone to Arkansas Baptist College down in Little Rock. And so they had an appreciation for education, and they tried to push us all they could.
The schools young Donald attended in Kansas were mostly integrated. Many of his peers were children of families who had left the South during the Great Migration in search of freedom from day-to-day oppression, better job opportunities, and access to quality schools. But racism was unfortunately still a fact of life in Kansas.
The system of segregation was a bitter pill for all who used it, but the great burden fell mostly upon persons of color.
By the time Donald was 12, the Great Depression was underway. By the mid-1930s, the Depression had taken its toll on the Hollowells, and in 1935, Donald left high school to join the Army. The unit he joined was none other than the all-black 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, who had gained national fame for their exploits on the American frontier in the late 1800s. But even while serving as a Buffalo Soldier, Donald's mind was still very much on education. Determined to finish high school, he received his diploma by completing a correspondence course during his tour of duty. And upon his discharge, an old friend who knew of Hollowell's determination to continue his education and his superior talent as an athlete encouraged him to try out for the Lane College football team. Earning a seat at Lane and a starting position on the football team, Hollowell headed south to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. Just as he was settling into the collegiate lifestyle, and a few months before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hollowell was called back into the Army, joining thousands of black men and women who were answering the call to once again fight for democracy. But separation of the races was still the law of the land.
Every black soldier in the whole of the Army and who was in the military in World War II, every black soldier would have his story to tell of what it meant to be in that kind of a segregated situation.
By July 1941, Private Hollowell was at the Fort Benning, Georgia Army Training School. By September, he was a corporal, the first stage of his rapid rise to the officer corps. It was during this tour of duty that Hollowell met Louise Thornton, who was to become his lifelong partner. Louise operated a beauty salon on historic Auburn Avenue in downtown Atlanta.
We found that we had many things in common. He liked dramas, he liked music. We just liked same things. He's very good in English, and I was good in English, so you see that all the things were right there for us to sort of get in love.
As the romance blossomed, so did Hollowell's military career. On May 12, 1942, he completed officer candidate school at Fort Benning, Georgia, and as a brand new second lieutenant was assigned to the 795th Tank Destroyer Battalion at Fort Custer, Michigan, for further training prior to overseas deployment. A few days before he had to leave for Fort Custer, he asked Louise to be his wife.
He said, when are we going to get married? I said, married? What are you talking about? I don't know. And he said, I said, but if we were going to get married, it wouldn't be before the fall. So he said, well, I'm going to be leaving. And he says, what's wrong with now?
And the honeymoon was even faster. Hours after the couple exchanged vows, Hollowell boarded the segregated train from Atlanta to his new tour of duty in an equally segregated United States Army.
I think Mr. Hollowell's experiences in the Army did an enormous amount to steel his resolve to go to war for civil rights, if you will. He had already been, as I mentioned, a private in the Army with the Buffalo Soldiers unit, and was in reserves, and on that basis had been called up in World War II. reported for duty up here in North Georgia at Fort Oglethorpe, and folks just fell over in a faint because they weren't expecting to see a black man come on the base, not in uniform. He was immediately assigned to the segregated eating facilities, segregated sleeping facilities. He was the only black man on the base, and they had to have a separate tent for him.
On November 4th, 1944, Hollowell shipped out from Boston for France. By Christmas, his unit had moved up to a combat zone on the Moselle River, where they served as firefighters and protected the field hospitals. In March of 1946, after nearly 2 years of overseas service, Hollowell boarded a ship in Antwerp, bound for home and for a new chapter in his life. By the summer of 1946, Hollowell had resumed the life of a college student, but the scars from his 8-year career in a segregated military were still fresh, and the burgeoning civil rights movement attracted him. In October 1946, shortly after he returned to Lane, Hollowell traveled to Columbia, South Carolina, to attend a convention of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Founded in 1937 and championed by black leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Esther Cooper Jackson, and Benjamin E. Mays, the Southern Negro Youth Congress was the forerunner of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The organization encouraged young blacks to take a militant stance against oppression and disenfranchisement, especially the new outbreak of lynchings and the notorious poll tax. Hollowell's exposure to civil rights activism at the convention changed the course of his studies and his life. Hollowell returned to Lane with a new vision and a new mission. He abandoned his plans for dentistry, changed his major to social science, and set his sights on law school.
I had seen enough in my own life by that time. You see, I was a man coming back into college after having been in the Army twice and having been both an enlisted man and an officer. And in my own mind, I had experienced enough to want to do something about it.
In 1947, with a magna cum laude diploma in hand, he headed north to Chicago and Loyola University's first-rate law school. 4 very long years later, and with another degree in hand, a degree that would supply his weapon of choice in the fight for justice, Hollowell returned to the South and the wife he dearly loved. It was a bittersweet return. As in World War I, military service had not delivered the respect and equality that blacks had hoped for. Jim Crow still ruled. But blacks were becoming more militant, too. Spearheaded by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and its Legal Defense Fund, blacks were taking the battle for equal justice to the courtroom.
Now this momentum, which was built up during World War II by black servicemen to do away with segregation, led to the NAACP taking a bolder step after World War II than they had prior to World War II.
And this was a battle Hollowell was eager to join. He was ready to become a foot soldier for justice. In 1953, 1 year after passing the bar, Hollowell opened his own office and set out to fight Jim Crow in earnest, a lifelong fight that would earn him the respect and admiration of his peers and a place in history. An important early case in Hollowell's rise to prominence occurred the year before the murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi. In 1954, he successfully defended Willie Nash, a 39-year-old black man tried in 1954 on charges of murdering a white man and raping a white woman.
There were no crimes in Georgia or in the South at that time that could have been more severely punished than the murder of a white man by a black man and the rape of a white woman by a black man. And the idea that not only would Hollowell represent him, but Hollowell would declare that he was innocent and prove that he was innocent.
During Nash's first trial, a solicitor steeped in the racial oppression of the day used a racial slur to describe his own witness. An animated Hollowell insisted that the use of the phrase "fat nigger" was grounds for a mistrial, and the judge conceded, declaring, "The law is zealous of not injecting the race question, especially when a man is on trial for his life." In a second trial, Hollowell represented Nash and delivered a brilliant defense before an all-white jury, and Willie Nash was acquitted. The Nash case was a powerful example of what was beginning to happen throughout the South as other foot soldiers for justice joined the battle. The NAACP was an important ally. Over a broad front, their lawyers were successfully challenging all forms of injustice, especially school segregation. The NAACP took the fight to the bastions of higher education. In 1950, Horace T. Ward, who would become a distinguished federal judge, applied to the University of Georgia Law School and, of course, was denied admittance. Besides stating that he was not qualified, the university threw up a barrage of procedural requirements, including a requirement that Ward obtain 3 references from members of the all-white law school alumni before his application could be considered. At that point, Ward decided to sue.
By June of 1951, it became clear that I would not get admitted. I had refused out-of-state aid, and the registrar had told me that my application was considered and was hereby denied. In the spring of 1952, after the rules had been changed, we decided, at least I decided on the advice of counsel, that we would no longer seek to satisfy the new requirements, but would file a lawsuit.
However, 30 days before Ward's case was scheduled for court, he was drafted into the Army. A very interesting coincidence, to say the least. Ward may have been deemed unqualified by the University of Georgia, but not by Northwestern University. Following a tour of duty in Korea and honorable discharge from the Army in 1955, Ward was admitted to Northwestern's prestigious law school. In the meantime, his case had dragged on and on. Shortly after he enrolled in Northwestern, his suit against the University of Georgia was dismissed. Despite the court's decision, Hollowell's legal work on the Ward case had set the stage for what was to come. Time would soon run out for Georgia's segregated school system. Meanwhile, there were plenty of other battles for Donald Hollowell to fight. For example, access to public facilities. Blacks might be able to patronize stores, restaurants, and theaters, but there was always a degrading twist. Backdoor entrances, separate seating areas, separate restrooms and water fountains, and generally disrespectful service. Hollowell himself was no stranger to such indignities. He recalled a typical example during an outing with his wife in Atlanta.
We went to the Fox, and I noticed that we went past the place where the tickets were sold there in the front, and we wound up on the back side where there must have been 150 steps, literally. And I told her then that but for you, I wouldn't even go in. And I said, I will never come back here.
In fact, Hollowell decided to refuse his patronage to any segregated facility and began to take cases involving equal access, such as the 1960 case for a black businessman denied service at Atlanta's airport restaurant. The case would eventually force the airport restaurant to serve blacks on an equitable basis. but many other doors remained shut, especially the doors to all-white schools. By 1958, 4 years after the Brown decision, Atlanta civil rights stalwart Jesse Hill and other black civic leaders had had enough and renewed the challenge to dismantle segregated public schools in Georgia. For their chief counsel, they chose Donald Hollowell. In July of 1959, Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes applied for admission to the University of Georgia. Their applications were rejected on transparently fraudulent grounds.
They told us, at that time, Georgia had a requirement that all freshmen live on campus, male and female. Now, females had to live on campus for 4 years. Males just for the freshman year, and then they could move anywhere they wanted to. So they told us that because of no dormitory space, they did not say because we were black they were not accepting us. They said because there was no dormitory space they could not accept us.
That disingenuous response would signal the start of a long legal process that would eventually end 175 years of segregation at the University of Georgia. Hollowell had been down this road 10 years earlier in the Horace Ward case. This time, he was determined to finish the fight. And this time, he would have at his side not only the veteran Constance Baker Motley, but 2 bright new recruits, his young law clerk, Vernon Jordan, and his former client and new law partner, Horace T. Ward.
I started working for Hollowell, as I said, the Monday after I graduated from law school. And that first day, we were in Atlanta Municipal Court getting demonstrators out of jail because the civil rights movement was hot. And so it was very exciting. I was the first young law school graduate that Hollowell brought to his office. Horace Ward came in September, and we had a very good time. I carried Hollowell's briefcase, I drove his car, I did his research. I studied under him. I was his law clerk, I was his intern, I was his mentee. And we had lots of little cases, too numerous to mention, having to do with violations of civil rights and asserting equal opportunity rights for plaintiffs. The most significant by far was the University of Georgia case.
Hollowell and his team would have to counter a host of familiar stalling tactics and maneuvers by state officials. Hollowell's strategy highlighted the similarities with the Ward case 10 years earlier. In one brilliant and ironic tactical move, Hollowell even used Horace Ward to question Holmes on the witness stand.
Here you've got the 2 black males that have applied, and one is now doing the direct examination on the other, and I think that's a very good strategy. When he was walking around, he'd raise his hand up and point his finger, and I mean he was just and he was always slow and deliberate, and I mean he was fantastic. I remember as a young man, I had never been in a court, never seen lawyers. So I was just fascinated by everything, and I mean Hollowell was just tremendous. He was the most impressive, one of the most impressive men that I'd ever seen.
Even Judge Bootle, who had never presided over a trial with a black attorney, was impressed. On January 6, 1961, Bootle delivered his eagerly awaited ruling. Finding for the plaintiffs, he ordered the immediate enrollment of Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter.
It didn't take much evidence. I had common sense. I could see they were black, and I knew what was going on as everyone else did. It didn't take much evidence to convince me that they were denied admission solely because they were black.
Immediately after that, Governor Ernest Vandiver entered the fray. Standing on his campaign promise of no, not one, he ordered all university funds to be cut off.
He was going to close the university to keep from complying with my order.
It was a decision he would regret years later, long after the dust of battle had settled.
I wouldn't have made the statement that neither my child or your child will ever go to an integrated school, no, not one. That was a statement I shouldn't have made.
Before victory could be declared, there would be a desperate last-minute legal skirmish and even student unrest. Riots broke out on the campus.
What do you think will happen when the students come back on campus?
I think the same thing's going to happen again. And I'm for anything that happens to them.
As to whether or not we've asked for any protection by the law enforcing authorities, we have not as such. I think that the city police there and such others as are deemed necessary by our Justice Department or the state police authorities would be certainly capable of handling the situation. I would just like to think that the people at the university and around the university are sufficiently fair-minded to want to see any Georgia citizen get the best education possible at the facilities which are provided by the state.
We were not afraid. I mean, I don't know why. We certainly, as young people at Turner High School, had been told about Emmett Till. We had read about Emmett Till. And as you know, Hamilton Holmes' family was a very race-conscious family, and I'm sure all of that was discussed in his family. But somehow it didn't cross our minds that anything could happen to us.
Why were you crying when you were taken from the dormitory last night?
I was crying because I was very disappointed and very hurt that I had been suspended.
Once we had gotten into university, for example, we were suspended the second day we were on the campus because of the riot outside of my dormitory. And we came to Atlanta in the middle of the night, and the next day the lawyers, Hollowell and Motley, went to court to get us readmitted. And we were readmitted immediately. On January 16th, Judge Boodle ordered the suspensions lifted, and Holmes and Hunter returned to class.
It just happened to happen on my watch. I don't deserve any credit, don't seek any. I did what any self-respecting, honest judge would have done.
Holmes and Hunter graduated from the University of Georgia in 1963. Holmes would go on to become a successful orthopedic surgeon, while Hunter would go on to achieve both fame and professional success as a journalist.
The most important thing about the two of them is that we were not wrong about their talent and about their ability to achieve, given the opportunity to do so.
Hollowell's triumph in dismantling segregation at Georgia's flagship school had an immediate impact on the Atlanta Public Schools case, in which he also served as chief counsel. Just a few months after Holmes and Hunter entered the University of Georgia, on August 30th, 1961, 9 black children were enrolled in 4 previously all-white Atlanta schools. The courtroom had clearly become the major battleground for the civil rights movement, and the new foot soldiers for justice, like Donald Hollowell, were becoming seasoned veterans.
Don Hollowell's impact was everywhere and on everything. He was a gentleman and a master, and more like a Shakespearean actor in the courtroom than the typical lawyers that we saw at that time. Even Thurgood Marshall could be kind of casual and folksy. But Don Hollowell and Constance Motley were the Shakespeareans. And it would always impress me whenever I was in a courtroom in that they would quote, not only would they quote the cases, but when the judges would run to send the law clerks to pick up the volume to check the case, they'd say, "You'd find that on page 365, Your Honor." You know, I mean, they were right on the case, and you just felt proud sitting in the courtroom watching them handle things.
The 1960s were also witnessing a new strategy in the fight against racial oppression. Civil rights groups like the NAACP, CORE, SCLC, and SNCC were forging alliances and engaging in mass protests. As the protests, picketing, demonstrations, and sit-ins increased, so did the arrests. Hollowell was one of those rare attorneys courageous enough to represent those who dared to take a stand.
Don Hollowell, C.B. King and others, they didn't like the idea of us getting arrested, going to jail all the time, because they knew jail was not a pleasant place. They didn't want us to get hurt. On the other hand, they said, if you go out there and do it, we're going to be there with you. We're going to defend you. And they did.
The same discrimination that Hollowell attacked on behalf of others, he often faced himself.
I can remember in Greene County, a bailiff not wanting Hollowell and I to sit where judges sit. Where lawyers sit. In the bar, he wanted to sit upstairs. So I said, you never seen the lawyer try a case from upstairs. And Hollowell, sensing that he had two fools in tow, went and talked to Judge Knight, and Judge Knight straightened out the bailiff.
With a firm that now included Horace Ward, William Alexander, Howard Moore, and Vernon Jordan, Hollowell was ready to take on the courtroom challenges presented by the new activism, including the defense of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. In protest of the Jim Crow practices among Atlanta's white businesses, Atlanta student movement leaders staged mass sit-ins at local department stores. On October 19, 1960, veteran civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King joined the demonstration, and he was among the over 50 demonstrators arrested, including SNCC leaders and 5 student body presidents from the Atlanta University complex. One of them was Julian Bond.
I had been chosen out of the group arrested at Atlanta City Hall to be tried for my group. I'm standing between these two men whom I meet for the first time in my life, Donald Hollowell on my right, A.T. Walden on my left, and I really don't understand what's happening. It's the first time I've ever been in court. And there's some back and forth between these two men and the judge. And the judge says to me, "How do you plead?" Well, I was stunned. How do I plead? I didn't know what to do. I turned to look at Colonel Walden, who was the older of these two men, and he was engaged in a conversation with the bailiff. So I couldn't get an answer there. I turned to Don Hollowell, and he said in this stage whisper, I'm sure could be heard throughout the whole classroom, he said, "Not guilty, you fool." And I said, "Not guilty."
This was Bond's baptism of fire. But King had been there before and was ready to fight from a jail cell if necessary. Refusing bail, he insisted that he would leave the jail only if the police dropped all charges. They refused, and King was hustled off to spend the first, but hardly the last, night of his life behind bars. The arrest, especially King's, escalated the threat of more protests. Anxious to avoid the violence that was becoming the hallmark of such protests across the South, city officials began negotiations with the civil rights groups. After 4 days of heated talks, the charges were dropped and the protesters were released. That is, all but King. Police were now holding him for violating probation, part of his sentence from neighboring DeKalb County for a minor traffic offense. DeKalb County's criminal court swiftly revoked King's probation, sentenced him to 4 months of hard labor, and ordered him taken to the county jail. By then, Hollowell and Ward had signed on as King's attorneys, but when Hollowell arrived at the DeKalb County jail, his client was no longer there. Under cover of night, DeKalb officials had whisked King off to the maximum security prison in Reidsville.
When he got there, he said, I came to get King out this morning, or something like that, to that effect. And he said, well, he ain't here. And he said, well, what do you mean he ain't here? He said, well, they took him away this morning sometime. I don't know whether they gave him the exact hour, but Don got the idea it was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And they carried him down to the state prison. And he said, that's where he is. He ain't here, so you can't get him. Well, Mr. Hollowell didn't like that.
That was the worst night of Martin Luther King's life. They took him from the DeKalb County, put him in leg irons and handcuffs, laid him on the floor in the back of a paddy wagon with nobody back there but a German Shepherd. And they drove him from Atlanta to Reidsville. That's 300 miles. There were no expressways then. 300 miles on bad Georgia roads. I never realized, he never talked about that much. He mentioned how that was the worst night of his life. Fortunately, he loved dogs and was not afraid of the police dog. That night was hell on earth. And Don Hollowell went down there to Reidsville to get him out.
You have asked me what other plans do we have in connection with Reverend Martin Luther King's release. Of course, this would depend upon whether or not the court granted our motion to vacate the order of yesterday. We would sincerely hope that he would grant that order and release Reverend King. If the court fails to release him, of course, we would take other steps to appeal or to effect a release of Reverend King from the Reidsville State Prison. However, we prepared a writ of habeas corpus, which we plan to submit this morning at 8 o'clock. However, when we called at 8 for the purpose of ascertaining the whereabouts of the sheriff for making service, we were informed that Reverend King had been taken down to Reidsville at 4:05 this morning.
King's imprisonment sparked a national outcry, and calls flooded into King's home in Atlanta and the prison in Reidsville. One of them was from presidential candidate John F. Kennedy. On the eve of the election, Kennedy seized the opportunity to reach out to black voters with his call to Coretta Scott King. That phone call helped galvanize the black vote, paving the way for Kennedy's election in a very close race. Ironically, Georgia's segregationist governor, the same Ernest Vandiver who had opposed Holmes and Hunter's admission to the University of Georgia, played a role in Dr. King's release.
And I got a call from then Senator John Kennedy. This was during the campaign. And he said, a judge down in Georgia has incarcerated Martin Luther King. He said, is there anything that you can do to help me get him out, because it would be helpful to my career? So I called my brother-in-law and a close friend of mine who had been Secretary of the State Senate when I was Lieutenant Governor. His name was George Stewart. George Stewart went out and talked with Judge Mitchell. And Judge Mitchell agreed. I don't know what George told him. He might have told him that he'd get him appointed federal judge or something. Anyway, he agreed that if either Senator Kennedy or Bobby Kennedy would call him personally and ask him to release Dr. King, that he would release him. Bobby Kennedy called Judge Mitchell, and Martin Luther King was released from jail.
But besides the high-level, behind-the-scenes political maneuvering, there was also Donald Hollowell's dogged foot soldiering. It was Attorney Hollowell who marched across Georgia, performing the legal work to get King released.
They were using what they had, every legal apparatus they had, to try to make the point that Martin Luther King Jr. Shouldn't be in prison in the first place, and he shouldn't be in Reidsville.
After representing King before the Georgia Court of Appeals, Hollowell chartered a plane to Reidsville to pick up his client, 8 days after police jailed him in Atlanta.
Dr. King would not have been released unless there was some legal action taken to release him. And the legal action that was taken to release him was a habeas corpus petition that Horace Ward and Donald Hollowell prepared and fought. It was Horace Ward and Donald Hollowell who were driving up and down the roadway of Georgia, going back and forth from Atlanta to Reidsville.
Hollowell and King would cross paths again during the struggle.
It would be interesting to watch a conversation between these two men. First, because Hollowell, as you know, is a very, very proper speaker. Hollowell speaks as if he were reading something written by someone in England, almost Elizabethan in his tone, in his manner. I don't think I've ever met a man of such formality. King, on the other hand, while he's, of course, spoke very, very well, probably the premier orator of our time, was a bit more informal, and I would love to have been the fly on the wall in a conversation between these two men about the events of the day or even some private kinds of things. I imagine it would have been fascinating.
By the spring of 1961, young freedom riders were taking to the busways all over the South to challenge the segregation of buses and terminals. Others were challenging segregated lunch counters and other public facilities.
At this moment, we have agreed to stay in the streets and not leave the streets and stay in whole villages right there until we are gassed away again. And if we're gassed, we return as soon as the gas dies down.
And in the fall of 1961, the shock troops of SNCC and SCLC converged on Albany, Georgia, in a campaign to challenge racial discrimination and segregation in that city.
Yes, we are interested in what the Justice Department can do for us here in Albany. But our primary concern is, at this point, what we can do for ourselves. And what we intend to do for ourselves is to press on. Press on. Every round gets higher and higher and higher. And no matter how rough and rugged that road to freedom might get, no matter how many of those cottonmouth moccasins and diamondback rattlesnakes may crop up on the one side, no matter how much the other side is lined by thorns and bristles, no matter how much segregation and discrimination hovers over our head, we're going to keep on treading down that rough road.
The Albany movement mobilized mass demonstrations, bus boycotts, sit-ins, and jail-ins. On December 16, 1961, after more than 500 demonstrators had been arrested, SCLC leaders Martin Luther King and Ralph David Abernathy joined the Albany movement with a prayer vigil at City Hall.
We pray, O God, that thou would touch the hearts of the leaders of this city and have them to know that there will be no peace in this community until those elected to high office will rise to stature and to the understanding that they will be willing to sit down and to talk and to discuss their problems with the leaders of the Negro people of this community.
Just move out or you're under arrest. Either one now. Doesn't make a difference to me.
Later that day, King, Abernathy, and another 100 demonstrators were arrested by Albany Police Chief Laurie Pritchett. Responding to the arrest, Hollowell teamed up with his longtime friend C.B. King, Albany's noted civil rights attorney. Together with the NAACP veteran Constance Baker Motley, they would represent King, Abernathy, and the other protesters.
When the Albany movement heated up in '61, when King got arrested, it was they who stepped into the breach, who filed lawsuits, who tried to fight off the attempts of the chief of police, Laurie Pritchett, to suspend the First Amendment in Albany.
When violence broke out, Albany was plunged into months of civic and legal chaos.
The United States government is involved in sitting down at Geneva with the Soviet Union. I can't understand why the government of Albany, City Council of Albany, cannot do the same for American citizens.
Hollowell and C.B. King were right in the middle of the battle.
Hollowell and C.B. King raised the legal questions and forced the government, both at the local and national level, local, state, and national levels, to face the issues of segregation and discrimination and brutality on the part of law enforcement officials. So they did it brilliantly, and Albany was never the same.
Hollowell's lawyering in the Albany movement solidified his reputation as a foot soldier for equal justice. As far as the students were concerned, he had earned a general's star.
The kids used to sing, King is our leader, Hollowell is our lawyer, we shall not be moved. King is our leader, Hollowell our lawyer, we shall not be moved.
The first time I met Don Hollowell, I was in jail. The sheriff had lined us up, told us to come out of our cages, cells, and he had lined us up. I told the boys under my breath, I got it, boys, I'll talk. I'll be talking. So he asked me where I'm from or something like that, and asked me some question that I had to have an opinion about, and I said no. The deputy on his left-hand side came down on my face with a pow and knocked me down. It was so hard. I got right back up and said something like, I'm a child of God and I love the Lord with all my heart and soul and mind, and you my brother. And he asked me another question, and whop, he knocks me back again. This time he didn't knock me down, but he knocked me across the room a little bit. But by that time, I got the point that he's trying to get me to say yes, sir. Because I was answering his question. But it was my first time being hit by a law officer, and I was bleeding and uncomfortable all night. But I was sure glad to see old Don Hollowell walking through the doors. I was happy to see Don that day.
When black people saw lawyers like King and Hollowell and Motley, it gave them courage, because they knew that, when I get arrested for, demonstrating or picketing or marching, I'm going to have somebody to speak for me.
Hollowell's law partner, Howard Moore, recalls the affection blacks had for Hollowell.
When I got down to Bibb County and went to the courthouse, there were about 3,000 Negroes on the steps. And I went into the courthouse, and there were about 3,000, or as many as they could get in the balcony upstairs. And when I walked in the courtroom, the people upstairs, the black people, said, that ain't Hollowell. Where's Hollowell? That ain't Hollowell. And so I sat down, and it turned out I'm at a coroner's inquest. I don't know what to do. I don't know. I have no idea what I'm supposed to do, So I said, well, I'll act like Hollowell. I'll just object in the loudest voice I can. And then people upstairs in the balcony said, well, it ain't Hollowell, but he sounds like Hollowell. And that was the A.C. Hall case, where he's a 15-year-old African-American who had been shot in the back by a police officer in Macon. And I hollered and screamed and objected as much as I could that afternoon. And we got a recess until, I think, Friday of that week or to the following week. And when I came back with Hollowell. And it's one of the most brilliant cross-examinations I've ever witnessed in my life, was Hollowell examining the police officer who shot A.C. Hall. Because the story was that Hall was approaching the police officer armed with some type of weapon. And the officer, then fearing for his safety and the safety of others, shot A.C. Hall in self-defense. But the true story turns out to be that when the officer shot A.C. Hall, Hall was approximately 50 feet from him, and his back was to the officer. And Hollowell literally had the officer on the stand under his cross-examination, physically turn A.C. Hall around so that his back would be to the officer at the time he was shot. And from the appearance at the officer at the moment of realization of what the effect of his answers to Hollowell's cross-examination were, it seems so tears came to his eyes, you know. And I've never seen that before or since, when a lawyer just take completely control of a witness and bind that witness to his will, not with shouting and screaming, but with systematic, well-structured, well-placed questions.
And I had never heard anything like it before in my life. I thought I was listening to the Black Shakespeare, you know, articulate, had great ideas, creativity.
Over the next 3 years, Hollowell and his partners challenged a number of discriminatory laws and won. In 1964, Hollowell and Ward won an historic case that desegregated Atlanta's huge metropolitan Grady Hospital and opened the doors of employment to black doctors, nurses, and dentists. They even tackled racially segregated neighborhoods in Atlanta. In the fight for equal justice, Hollowell also took on several criminal cases during the 1960s. Perhaps Hollowell's most celebrated criminal trial came during the same year as the historic Albany movement. On August 16, 1961, an all-white jury deliberated only 45 minutes before a 15-year-old Preston Cobb was sentenced to death for the shotgun murder of a white man. When Cobb's court-appointed white attorney failed to appeal the verdict, a frantic Lethe Cobb, Preston's mother, contacted Hollowell's law firm, and Hollowell took the case. 5 days before Cobb's appointment with the state of Georgia's electric chair, Hollowell won a stay of execution for his client.
When you're being tried, you're a black person, you're being tried by a white judge who knows the deceased, white prosecutor who knows the deceased, white lawyer who knows the deceased, all within a 15, 20-mile span of each other. I mean, what do you expect to come out of it? I mean, you know, when you've been accused of doing something to somebody white too. You know, I didn't have no idea what even was going on until that judge said, well, you're going to be an executor. Hell, I didn't even know what the word execution meant.
To block the execution and gain time to prepare a defense, Hollowell filed a motion for a new trial. His first move was to question the exclusion of blacks from the jury rolls.
No blacks on the jury, no nothing. No nothing. And when they did have a list that compiled of blacks and whites, they always put a W by the white's name and a C by the black name for color. That's when Mr. Hollowell didn't find out what they were doing with the jury poll and stuff. They go down the list, they know who they picking. That's how I end up with all white jury.
Hollowell turned to the federal Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals for justice. The court ordered a new trial, citing the systematic exclusion of blacks from juries in Jasper County. The case would bounce back and forth between state and federal courts for 11 years while Cobb remained in prison.
I don't think I never would have got rid of that life sentence, that electric chair, or that life sentence had it not been for Hollowell and his office.
Hollowell had not only prevented the tragic execution of a black youth, he had also exposed the double standard of justice in Georgia's criminal courts, and the case drew national attention.
Eleanor Roosevelt became involved in this case. It was the classic case of a young black man, defenseless young black man, being charged with murder of an established white figure.
By 1964, the year of the historic Civil Rights Act, Hollowell had been at the center of the struggle for over a decade and was beginning to wonder about new challenges. New marching orders came in 1966 when President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed him as regional director of the newly created Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. In 1971, he accepted the presidency of the Voter Education Project's Board of Directors.
When he took over in '71, there were, I guess, maybe 3 million African-American voters in the country. When he left, there were between 5 and 6 million. voters in the country.
By 1986, Donald Hollowell had served over 40 years on the front lines in the battle for social justice, and the battle-scarred old warrior decided it was time to retire from active duty. He left behind a record of victories that had shaped the outcome of the struggle and an inspirational example for other foot soldiers for justice. In 2002, Hollowell was awarded an honorary doctorate by University of Georgia President Michael Adams, and a professorship in his name has been established at the University School of Social Work to continue his legacy for the cause of social justice. And his portrait now hangs in the Fulton County Courthouse, where he often argued against social injustice.
Hollowell and these others advanced justice and freedom. They really helped make democracy real, beginning in the 1950s, leading into the 1960s, sometimes carrying over to the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. They really helped make democracy work by chipping away case by case, plaintiff by plaintiff, school by school, to knock down this evil system of institutionalized, legalized racial separation.
To describe the legacy of someone like Don Hollowell, who, like Martin Luther King, I mean, you know, they were all of a piece in a sense. I mean, they transformed the South and in the process transformed us. And so in a real sense, while they transformed the South, they left a living legacy, because all of us who were touched by him, Don Hollowell, in one way or another, have continued on a path wrapped in those values and hopefully spreading those values wherever we are. I have young people that I am associated with, maybe as a mentor, but certainly as young people I'm close to. And I try to transmit those values to them. And hopefully they'll transmit them to their own and to those with whom they come in contact who are younger. And so it's a living legacy, and it'll never die.
I asked him one day, I said, Don, are you afraid? He said, no, I'm not afraid. I said, well, you don't know any better. I said, if you were born in this section of the country, if you were born where I was born, or in Atlanta, or any of these southern states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia particularly, I said, then you would be afraid. He said, I wasn't afraid.
His counsel, his briefs, his ability to articulate the law from the perspective of the Constitution was very significant. He was masterful, and he was princely in his presentation. He was thoughtful in his writings. He was effective in his argument, and stunning in his presence. And I think that he is among the top echelon of African American lawyers in terms of the civil rights struggle. And if there were any justice, he would have been a federal judge, maybe even the Supreme Court.
Donald Hollowell died in 2004 and was buried with the honors of a field marshal in the battle for equal justice. At his funeral, dignitaries of the civil rights movement, many of them direct beneficiaries of Hollowell's hard-fought battles, paid homage to their leader and comrade in arms. Among those who honored him were presidential advisor Vernon E. Jordan, journalist Charlene Hunter Galt, former UN Ambassador Andrew Young, and federal judge Horace T. Ward.
He cared about America. He was a Buffalo soldier. He was my man, and I'm sad that he's gone.
Judge Marvin Arrington, who credits Hollowell for saving the soul of Georgia, simply but profoundly captured Hollowell's achievements. He said, "Every time you take a drink of water from a fountain that doesn't say whites only, you should say thank you, Don Hollowell. Every time you use a public restroom that doesn't have a sign that says whites only, you should say Thank you, Don Hollowell.